You're listening to the Doctor Is In podcast. This is the show where you get the best tips, tricks, and nutritional hacks to help you and your family get healthier. You'll also hear what works and what doesn't work so you don't have to waste your time and money. All right, let's get started.
Hello, I'm Dr. Tony Martin Jr.
And I'm Dr. Tony Martin Sr.
And this is the Doctor Is In podcast, and this is episode 112. And on today's podcast, we want to talk about the differences between food allergies and food sensitivities, because a lot of more people these days do have actual food allergies, but food sensitivities or intolerances are extremely common, and there's a good chance that some of your symptoms that you're experiencing right now are actually due to the fact that you have an intolerance to a certain food. But we'll talk about that. But before we do that, let's just talk quickly, because this is we didn't get a chance to talk about this on a podcast yet, but within the last couple weeks, the sugar company, aka Big Tobacco, really had a rough week. I mean, they've had a rough month, but it's really interesting, right? They got caught suppressing. They got caught suppressing a study that they had done way back in 1965 through 1971.
Yeah, and with the link between sugar and heart disease, right?
The link between sugar and heart disease and sugar and cancer. And they suppressed the results of a study because they didn't want to open that door. I'll read you a quote from the article that was published in a journal back in the end of November. And according to internal documents, the sugar industry did not disclose evidence of harm from animal studies that would have, one, strengthened the case that coronary heart disease risk of sucrose is greater than starch, and two, caused sucrose to be scrutinized as a potential carcinogen. So that's what they did. They suppressed evidence. And what's unfortunate, so this is back in the 60s and early 70s, and think about since then, right? You had fat was vilified. Indirectly, doctors and government agencies would tell you that since fat is so bad, you are probably better off consuming sugar rather than fat. How many millions of lives, really, without exaggerating, has this cost in terms of public health?
Well, like there used to be the expression back in the maybe 10 years ago when it said George Bush lied and people died, right? Because they had talked about, remember that Iraq was supposed to have these these
weapons of mass destruction,
and they didn't find any. And they said, well, he lied and people died, right? So that was very common expression. But the food industry lied and people died. They actually suppressed. It's criminal when you think of they knew and they suppressed it. They knew that sugar was detrimental to your health. It was as bad or if not worse than smoking for cardiovascular, for cancer. We all know about smoking. And we all know, and you said it, right? The Big Tobacco, because, there's movies been made of what the Big Tobacco did to suppress studies that they knew caused heart disease and cancer. And the only dent that we've ever seen in cancer rates really had been when people stopped smoking. So when the science came out, and everybody's on it now, don't smoke. But sugar was different, right? Because it was made up. It made up all of the food industries,
Food companies spend a lot of money marketing the idea of pretty much everything's acceptable as long as it's part of a well-balanced diet. Well, first of all, I don't even know what that word balanced means, right? Because based on the guidelines by Canada and United States, if you were to analyze what they're really saying, it's like 55-60% carbohydrates. Well, that's not a balanced diet. That's not a balanced diet in any way. But it really happened. They took the fat out of foods and they replaced it with sugar.
Yeah.
And
it's cheap.
It's cheap, and that, fat adds flavor, so they added a little bit of sugar. And, one of the things that kind of irritates me, is, whenever you start talking about sugar and obesity, for example, somebody will always show a chart that shows that sugar intake is actually decreasing and obesity still increasing. And they're, and they'll like, oh, see, it's not tied in.
Yeah.
But here's the problem I have with that. What happens if it's just too high? Even if sugar intake is decreasing, it's still way higher than it should be.
Oh, yeah.
So what happens if it's all too high? Well, yeah, so, sugar consumption has been decreasing and obesity is still increasing. Yeah, so what? What happens if the amount that it's still decreasing to is still much higher than it should be? But regardless, one of my favorite things last year, right around this time, one of the social media posts from a local hospital was from a group of dietitians, and they put out their cancer myths, and one of them that sugar feeds cancer. And then what was funny, literally, I'm not kidding you, like 3 weeks later, a massive article comes out showing that sugar can feed cancer. So it's kind of one of those things. But at the end of the day, big food companies, they sponsor a lot of these nutritional associations, and they spend a lot of money to get people to consume sugar, and it's worked. I mean, it really has worked.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, they just got caught, again, suppressing evidence that there might have been an issue with, sugar intake and heart disease and sugar intake and cancer.
Yep. And if you do nothing else, so just, maybe, I always tell my patients this, right? I mean, if, here's what I want you to go home with. I usually give them a plan, but I always say, look, if you do nothing else, if you cut the sugar almost completely out of your diet or certainly way down, only good things will happen.
And the thing
only
is
good
that
things will happen.
you have to be like Sherlock Holmes to do that, right? Because, I mean,
It's in everything.
Like I said, there's a term, hidden sugars. I mean, they've come up with like a lot of different ways to name sugar. I mean, you got to give it to them. They have like a whole Klingon language just for sugars.
Yeah.
I mean, there's so many different names. And then, we get this question a lot, not as much anymore because the gig's up, but, then a lot of people, there's always these alternative sugars that come out, like agave, right? And then it's like agave was worse. It was like high fructose corn syrup. I mean, there's nothing natural about agave, right?
Yeah, it's 10 times sweeter than,
So
you might as well have sugar.
They try all these different ways to get, all these different names and all these different things and high fructose corn syrups and all these different. But at the end of the day, like you said, eliminating processed foods, because that's where you find these sugars, it will do wonders for your health.
Yep.
Wonders. All right. So that was a little bit of a distraction. Let's get into what we really want to talk about. And this comes up a fair amount as well. And I'll kind of paint you a little bit of a picture of what we see a lot of times, right? So, and we'll talk about the difference between food allergies and food intolerances. But here's a common thing that we see, right? So a person gets up in the morning, they have some cereal, or they have like a milk in their coffee, and then next thing you know, they're clearing their throat, right? They're clearing their throat, and they don't even associate the fact that their body is increasing mucus production because it didn't like what they had just eaten. So the body kind of had a little mild immune reaction, increases mucus production. Or a lot of people on the back end of their day end up with a lot of post-nasal drip at nighttime, right? And they have a yogurt later in the day, or they have something, and their body, same thing, right? They get a lot of increased mucus production. They lie down at nighttime, and it just causes them issues at nighttime. So that's one thing that you have to look at and say, okay, your body's telling you something. Let's just talk quickly about the differences between a food allergy and a food sensitivity or a food intolerance. And those words are kind of used interchangeably. There's no real consensus. Is it a sensitivity? Is it an intolerance? Potato, it doesn't matter. It's the same thing. So a food allergy has a definite immune component to it. And a lot of times multiple organs get involved, and they could be quite deadly, right? I mean, we see
peanuts, right?
Yeah, a real rise
in
peanut allergies, a real rise in a lot of these things. Whereas on the other hand, a food insensitivity, which is very, very common, it's like a delayed reaction in a sense. It's a mild your body's telling you, and we're going to talk about the symptoms here, because sometimes they're not that mild of symptoms. They just never get associated. And here's the issue, because you can consume a food and then your body over the next day and a half doesn't like it. So it can be very difficult to pinpoint exactly what's causing that sensitivity. And we'll talk about in a second some of the more common foods that we see and that you see in clinic that are causing issues. And I could talk a little bit about my experience as well. We'll talk about that in a minute. But let's talk about, it was interesting. There was a study done that kind of compiled the most common symptoms associated with a food sensitivity. So, one of them, almost 60% of the people that have food sensitivities reported mood changes. Amazing what happens, right? Yeah. But again, we talked about on the last podcast, right? Serotonin,
your feel-good hormone, right?
And there's a direct nerve that connects your gut to your brain.
Vagus nerve. Las Vegas.
Not Las Vegas. Vagus nerve. And so there's a definite connection between your mood and your gut, right? So you have a little bit of a reaction in your body, a little bit of inflammation. It affects your mood, right? So a mood change can be associated with, and it's a common indication of a food sensitivity. Headaches, very high.
Yeah.
Headaches are kind of like the canary in the coal mine a lot of times, right? Your headaches is kind of like very tough to pinpoint. So many things can cause a headache. But again, an issue with a food can cause a headache.
It's amazing, Noe, when you clean up your diet, like just generally clean up your diet, just how a lot of these symptoms go away. I hear that every day in the office because we've done a real cleanup of the diet. I just got a text this morning from one of my patients and just asking, well, I want to introduce more food, right? You've had me on a very limited diet, right? But, she had severe IBS and severe intolerances, right? Food intolerances. So I said, well, until we fix you up, I'm not letting you, you're going to eat 5 or 6 things and live on it, right? Now, of course, feeling 1,000% better. But it's amazing how many other symptoms have gone away, and the things that you're talking about.
And that you would not necessarily associate, right?
It wouldn't have associated. Said, oh, yeah, my moods are better.
Yeah. So, and another common one that is, a very common symptom or complaint of people that have food sensitivities is musculoskeletal pain. Mm-hmm. Makes sense. Inflammation increases. Again, muscle pain, unless you've gone and done something, if your muscles start to ache, that's an indicator.
Yeah.
I mean, and there's a lot of things that can cause your muscles to ache. But one of them could be the food that you're eating. You would never necessarily associate that with it, but I mean, that's a big symptom of a food intolerance. And upper respiratory. And this is something, now I remember, I'll share the story of my son. When he was younger, had real bad asthma. I mean, you remember Ethan had a lot of asthma, a lot of asthmatic symptoms, right?
And how many thousands of kids
and we would go to the hospital and all these kind of things.
Real breathing
and I was a student back then, and all of a sudden I'm like, let's cut out dairy. Has never had an issue since. How common is that of an issue for kids with asthma? It's a food sensitivity, and a lot of times it's dairy, right? Dairy. If you have a problem with dairy, you're going to make mucus. You're going to make it, and it's going to end up in your lungs. It's going to give you a lot of issues.
Yeah.
So that's a big, big issue as well when it comes to upper respiratory. And it's funny, some people end up getting this time of year, especially, they end up getting the flu or they end up getting an upper respiratory tract infection, but really they're predisposed to it because they constantly are making more mucus anyways because of the foods that they're eating. Their body's rejecting in some way, and they just become predisposed. So that's another one. Of course, another big one is some kind of abdominal or bowel disturbance, right? Abdominal pain, abdominal discomfort, cramping, and all those kind of things. And again, the difficulty is that a lot of times and they're not instant. So what happens? This is the difficulty.
Yeah, gas.
So, a lot of gas, a lot of those kind of things. And So what happens is they eat lunch and then their stomach bothers them instantly, but it's not from the food that they just ate. It could have been from breakfast. It could have been from the supper before. I mean, that's the difficulty, right? So, but that is a common thing as well. Gas, discomfort, bloating, all those kind of things, right? Messed up bowels, IBS symptom type things, right? Another common thing as well is hives, skin rashes. Some people always have hives or skin rashes. Now, for some women, that could be thyroid, but it definitely could be leaky gut.
Yeah.
But you could see again, right, the food allergies. Now, and here's a question before we go on. It's like the chicken and the egg, right? They end up with food sensitivities because they have leaky gut, and because they have leaky gut, they end up with more food sensitivities. It just kind of goes. And the more food sensitivities they have, the more inflammation they have, the more leaky gut they have, the more food sensitivities. Yeah. And then next thing you know, and by the way, I read this not too long ago, and I've seen this before, but I kind of saw this again, that it could take up to a year to repopulate your gut after a round of antibiotics. A full year. So think of all the things that can develop in that year, which is, again, reason number 6,542 why you should be taking probiotics every day.
Yeah.
But anyways, all right. So skin's a big one, swelling, edema. And another big one as well is palpitations at nighttime. People lie down, they get these palpitations at nighttime. And they end up Googling it because they think they're going to have a heart attack.
Yeah.
But that's another thing, right?
And they got a sensitivity.
Yeah. I mean, I would rule out cortisol first, because cortisol should be decreased at nighttime. And, they're stressed or whatever. But, I mean, that's a definite thing. So night sweats, flushing, sweating, those things. Urinary disturbances. A lot of people have issues, urinary tract, or they're urinating too much. And it's amazing, right? It could be a food thing. And then, so those are the kind of common digestive or not even digestive issues that go along with a food sensitivity. So let's talk quickly about the most common allergies that you see are food sensitivities.
Yeah, well, generally, and I tell patients this, right? I like to say, well, look, let's do 3 things that I want you to cut out. We'll reintroduce them if they're not bothering you. But one of them is, you just mentioned dairy. And a lot of times with dairy, I differentiate between milk, yogurt, and cheese.
Yes.
A lot of people can have cheese,
but not yogurt.
Not
and
yogurt.
Milk.
They can't have ice cream, and they can't have, it's more lactose than it is the
hard cheeses they usually are okay with.
Yeah, they're pretty good usually. Yeah,
not always.
Because the protein is good, the amount of fat in there is good, the casein or the casein or whatever which way you want to pronounce the milk, the dairy protein. So we talked about that. Secondly,
and this is my issue, which is unfortunate, is eggs.
Yeah, and I get them to eliminate eggs, right, temporarily, to see if that could be one of the things, because we know eggs are good for you.
Oh, they're tremendous.
Eggs are tremendous. One of the nature's greatest foods is an egg.
Their ratio of fat to protein is awesome.
Yeah.
Tons of amino acids. Yeah. It really is.
B vitamins.
If you had to eat like one food for the rest of your life to provide everything, eggs would be on that list, right? It's just that it's that good for you.
But there are just a lot of people today that cannot break down eggs.
Yeah, they have a hard time, and usually it's the egg whites that are the main thing. Most people that have a hard time with eggs, it's egg whites. Some people it's the yolk, but that's not as common, and some are both. Now, what's also interesting is that a lot of people actually have an issue with soy, and so many chickens are fed these days. The meat that we eat and the
so
like
now
the hens,
it's ending up in the eggs.
Hens are fed a lot of the soy-based stuff, right? And what's funny is this with chicken, right? Like A&W, for example, it's like all of our chickens are fed vegetarian diets. I'm pretty sure that chickens aren't vegetarians. They pretty much eat everything, bugs, and like they're not. They act like it's the healthiest alternative. All of our chickens are vegetarian. It's like, well, I'm pretty sure chickens aren't vegetarian.
Yeah.
But anyways, so a lot of these things, a lot of hens and all that are fed soy-based stuff, and that can kind of make its way into. So, there's a lot of different reasons. Yeah. But, eggs is a big one. And I know for me personally, when I was in college and I was having all those digestive issues, eggs was the big one. Now, the nice thing is when you correct a lot of your issues with leaky gut, you can, reintroduce a lot of these things. And
a lot of times you do very well with them, and some people just, can't have them, avoid.
And I blame Mom for all this, right? I blame Mom because, unfortunately with her history, she the whole time pregnant with me, she's on antibiotics.
Yeah, kidney infection.
So I mean,
she only had one kidney, so
yeah, they had her. I was amazed. I always get amazed when I hear how many years back then their when she was growing up, she had one kidney, and she's on antibiotics for like almost a decade. That has impacted her health, and a lot of the stuff she's doing now has helped her a lot.
Oh yeah.
But
she's our guinea pig, right?
Because, that's right, but it's left a lingering effect.
And I could talk about your digestive history, and rushing you to the hospital, and you weren't even 6 weeks old.
Yeah, and again,
thought you were going to die.
I had no. You could. I mean, it makes sense. I had no flora. I had no microbiome. Right. I mean, you can see that.
You're talking the 70s, right?
Yeah. So I mean, it really, for me, it came home to roost when I was early in college, and I started getting all those digestive issues. Have been bad. I mean, a lot of pain. Now everything's functioning so much better. Mm-hmm. But I mean, we've developed and changed and tested probiotics over the years, and a lot of it is selfish reasons for ourselves. Because
you picked handpicked the microbiome.
So I mean, it has gotten a lot better, and in fact, it's very, very good.
We got to talk about a little bit about this, because I always say in the office, gluten schmooten, right?
Yeah,
because that's got a lot of.
And it's not that you're anti-gluten, no. In a sense, anti-gluten are celiac, because there are celiac.
Yeah. And it's more common today, but the celiac is autoimmune, right?
Yes. And
so we see a lot more autoimmune today.
And there's a whole thing about non-gluten sensitivity, right? Because, a lot of people seem to have issues with gluten-based foods, but they're not celiac. And however, you have an interesting take on, what your theory behind that is.
Well, it's carbohydrates, right? So it's crappy carbs.
Yeah, vegetable oil, processed
when
foods.
you really look at where gluten is found, right? Gluten is usually found on your carbohydrate side, your breads, your pastas, your noodles, your cereals, those are the kind of things that have gluten, your bagels, your muffins, and the glue, right? Think of glue. It glues those foods together. What people say, well, yeah, but, there's a whole industry now on gluten-free foods, and all they do is substitute the gluten. As soon as you take gluten out of food, don't taste good anymore.
Well, and the sad thing is that a lot of those gluten-free foods, I mean, you have to, if you have somebody that's celiac or really has an issue, you have to look at a lot of those foods, because, man, I'll tell you, a lot of the stuff that they use in there are so highly insulinogenic, right? They just cause such an insulin spike after eating. Yeah. They're terrible. They may not have gluten, but in a lot of ways they end up being worse than the wheat or the gluten foods that they were eating before. It's just now they've removed the allergy, but they end up eating foods that are just terrible. So a lot of times if you're gluten intolerant, actual celiac, then you do better eating, meats and veggies and fruits and stuff like that rather than the processed stuff. But you're right. I mean, there are a lot of people who seem to react to a lot of the gluten foods but aren't celiac. And that's why I like when you say gluten schmooten, because it's not the gluten necessarily. Now, they may have a food sensitivity to it that won't necessarily show up in testing. But a lot of the times, I'm telling you, the more I read on this issue and the more I see studies on it, I'll tell you, those vegetable oils are bad. They're bad news. Yeah. They are bad news.
Well, think of it. You could run your car on those things.
They're
right?
so inflammatory. Yeah. So if you're consuming a high-processed diet, your gut is irritated all the time. Your gut is swollen. Your gut is angry. Your gut is leaking. Yeah. And that just causes, so then think about this, right? So, we talk about leaky gut a lot. And, it's a great name because your gut is literally leaking into
So proteins coming up.
And your body's going to react. Your immune system's going to go crazy.
Albicans,
yeah. Your immune system's going to go nuts. Yeah. And one of the things that happens is that you get inflammation. And as a result of inflammation, your gut is irritated. And then foods are bothering you.
Is there ever an autoimmune that we've ever seen that don't have leaky gut?
Oh, no. They're hand in hand. And that's why those processed oil, like I'm getting just as hard in my head on vegetable oils as I am on sugar.
Yeah.
Vegetable oils, they really pulled a fast one on people. I mean, they are terrible. We consume so many of them nowadays. They're just not good for you in any way.
70 pounds, the average
of
statistic.
pure chemicals.
Yeah.
It's just terrible. But so
highly industrialized oil.
So a lot of people have food sensitivities because of the processed oils that they're consuming that's irritating their gut. And it's, a really interesting thing that we talked about before.
And almost all gluten-free food, by the way, is processed with
bad vegetable oils.
Yes. So be careful with that food.
You're eliminating one thing and causing another issue, right? Mm-hmm. So, then there's this whole idea of a histamine intolerance, right? So you think of your histamine production as a bucket, and all these foods are causing histamine production, and then eventually that bucket spills over, and you get a whole bunch of symptoms, and it rinses and repeats. So you can, you go through a period when that food seems to be okay, and then that histamine bucket fills up in a sense.
But you were saying it too, and it's so true. When I see it in the office, it says chronic sinusitis, chronic clearing the throat, chronic lung inflammation, asthma.
Asthma is one of those things. I mean,
yeah,
asthma,
and it's 100-fold compared to it. You know what? I can tell you when I was a kid. I can tell you in the 1950s, when I went to school, there weren't one student that I can think of that had lung issues and asthma. It just didn't happen. There might have been, but if there was, was
not
never,
like today.
There was never a puffer that I ever saw. And kids today, I mean, it's
well, they're consuming, and again, kids are unfortunately an experiment because they're live on processed food. They get all their protein from grains and processed food, so their lungs are taking a beating. The mucus production, unfortunately, asthma a lot of times is diet related. And they're chronically low in vitamin D, and there's so many aspects. I'll tell you, I love, just as an aside, I love the combination of pine bark extract and quercetin for lung health. Tremendous for opening those lungs up, helping people. Real good for kids with lung issues. Fantastic. That combination of pine bark, which is our Navitol, and then the quercetin. Awesome for lungs, but that's another thing. So, all right. So we talked about the symptoms of food intolerances, and you can see they overlap with a lot of other issues as well, and very, very, very common. And again, a lot of it has to do with leaky gut. It has to do with irritation of the gut. So probiotics is an absolute must for people with food intolerances. We also, we created a product called IBS formula, and a lot of the things in there are very, very good for the gut lining, gut health, things like slippery elm bark and marshmallow root extract.
L-glutamine.
All those things are so good for you, right? So there's a lot that you can do, but if you have food sensitivities, and you do, you have to eliminate that food for a bit at least, and then you have to repair your gut. You can't just eliminate and not repair, because the second you go back and start to eat some of those foods, usually it comes back pretty quickly. So you have to identify whatever is irritating, which is not easy to do, but it's doable. And then you have to repair your gut. You repair it by, bone broth and probiotics and all those kind of L-glutamines.
Digestive enzymes.
And that's another issue in itself, is a lot of people end up with food sensitivities because they just don't have enough digestive enzymes. The food's not breaking down. It's causing irritation.
It comes in too whole. It comes in unbroken, right?
Yeah,
and
it just causes an immune reaction.
Yeah. So. Your body sees it as a foreign invader rather than a nutrient, right?
Yeah. So, again, we shared a lot of information. So if you have any questions,
about the gut forever.
Feel free to email us at info@martinclinic.com. If you're not a newsletter subscriber, head over to our website and sign up, martinclinic.com. We talk again about a lot of these things in our newsletters. Again, we really want to thank you for listening, and be sure to tune again next week. Have a great day.